very senior and chairs the finance projects and insolvency at Cyril Amochan Mangaldas. He's a partner there. Girish, again, a very accomplished, sort of a distinguished person here on the panel. He is an NGI research scholar at Stanford University. And he deals with climate finance and related aspects at multiple other universities, including Imperial College. Dr. Wang, is she around? I'm not able to see her. Probably she will be joining soon. She's a senior energy specialist at the World Bank. I have Sato-san. He heads the Asian Development Department at Osaka Gas. And that's where the panel, as you could see, brings a very diverse background. And everyone here on the panel has a very important sort of a role as we talk of the subject, which is very important. Investments and financing for rapid decarbonization. I think I will just set a little bit of a context and then go to my sort of a co-panelist. We have been, and I'm sure that you have watched yesterday entire enriched sessions after the COP26 Glasgow. There is a very enhanced activity and an expectation of, if I can use the word, a seismic sort of a change across the energy value chain, across to meet the objective that everybody is gunning for. That brings a larger part and a white elephant in the room, which is about the capital and the transition. One is the transition. How do you make the transition? And the transition pays for developing countries, which is like India, and emerging economies versus the developed nations. That's a one debate. And second is the capital. Where is the capital going to come from, and how much is the capital which is one needs? Is it going to be available, and most importantly, at what cost as well? I think these are the two large sort of buckets one has to really look at. And I think when again it was talked about a one Earth, one consistent climate goal, which is very noble and very important. But as I said, when it comes to capital, it varies significantly when you talk of a political sort of a boundaries and the geographies around. The cost of capital, availability of a capital, both. Another dimension that I think I will touch upon that given the co-panelist background is you can look at certain sectors like electricity where I think you can see a low-hanging sort of a fruit, if I can call, in some parts of the components. But if you come to the sectors like shipping, aviation, metals and mining, right? Which are a very core component for industrial growth, economic growth of a nation, and they're a large contributor towards the global emissions as well at the same time. How do you deal with those sort of sectors as well, which are the more tougher than what you see as a low-hanging fruit? The commercialization of technologies, right? New advancement, new technologies. One is on the pilot sense, one is on a small scale, and how do you sort of commercialize on a much larger scale? And again, what is the cost that one has to really talk about that? And then we have seen in Indian context, FGD was talked about a lot, but what it brings along with that, and how the resistance, you talked of something which has been talked for almost like 5-7 years now in Indian context, but even a small change in the tariff associated with that becomes a very big stumbling block. So how do you deal with that? And the last kind of a scale that we're talking about. And I think, the last point in my mind which comes is that does everyone really understand that what is climate sort of a change, ESG, net neutral, net zero that we are talking about? What does it mean in real terms? Is there a sort of a consistent framework or understanding across as to what will lead to a net zero, for example? And therefore, it flows down to the kind of number of opportunities, investment opportunities that one come across. And when the institutions like World Bank, ADB, or multilaterals are looking for financing, or anybody for that matter, what is a framework which is going to be applied for? Because I think, that framework, what we have done in the past, for example, is no longer going to be relevant, or it has to be actually streamlined and made much more sturdy and robust before you start saying, okay, this investment qualifies for what we are looking at. And then how do we actually measure the capital going towards that investment, which may not be just the financial metric. So I think these 5 or 6 sort of a broad points to set the context. I think what I've sort of proposed to do is that given the panel, I have a specific pointers to each of my co-panelists. But before that, it will be good to have a 5 minute sort of an opening remarks to each of the co-panelists so that they can just have their sort of a perspective overall. And then I will have a few questions specifically addressed to everybody as well. So maybe, Rajiv, I can start with you. Your 5 minutes, quick overall perspective, focusing on the investment and the financing as you see that.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Manish, and thanks for inviting me. I feel thoroughly underqualified to be on this panel, which is causing me some performance anxiety. Just a few comments on the whole issue, a little bit of background. As a somber reminder to all of us, I was in Glasgow. The carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere in the 1920s was something around 280 to 285 parts per million. In the 1960s, it was around 330, and currently it is about 450. Just to remind each one of us, the last time the planet saw such a concentration was 3 million years ago. Homo sapiens did not exist. So I think just a little bit of a somber reminder that we are talking here not because we are great corporates and great people, but it really is a code red emergency. So that's point number one. The point number two I will say is, for me, and you referred to the color of my hair at the beginning of the conversation. I really don't care whether India reaches, I do, but I don't care in a sense whether, as a citizen, whether India reaches net zero in 2070 or 2060. What matters to me is where are we in 2030 and 2025. I think that's what Dr. Jennifer was saying in the other session as well. Let's focus on what we can do now and worry about, what technologies, what financing, what innovation will come in 2045s and 2050s. Our successors and some of the younger people on this panel might worry about that and find a solution. Now, coming to India's electricity sector, I think there were some positive moves. There are some inevitable, contradictions. If we have, first is about energy versus capacity. Obviously, 50% energy terms is not possible, is not practical. So what we meant was capacity. But if 500 gigawatts constitutes 50%, that means we'll have 50% of 500 gigawatt of thermal capacity, which means we are going to build 300 gigawatt of coal-fired and gas-fired power plants over the next 9 years. So obviously, it doesn't stack up. But if we can just simplify matters and say, let's say our target is 500 gigawatts of renewable, traditional, of non-fossil, that basically translates into about 300 gigawatt of incremental renewables, wind, solar, wave, which is hardly there. So is it possible? Yes, it is possible. Is it likely? Answer is no. It is not likely. The maximum we have done is 11.7 gigawatts in a year. For us to move to 30 gigawatts a year after year for a decade would require some very deep and very significant reforms, particularly in the distribution side. I think we know that the central government is trying to do that, but it still requires quite a bit. And it is particularly challenging for us, given that the concept of a transition fuel has never really been accepted in our country. And therefore, for us, I think going into the next decade, a significant investment in storage, which currently at the moment seems battery, is I think crucial. Now, I'm a little bit cynical about developed world financing, although I know that is the topic of today's discussion. It struck me, it was not my thought, it is the thought of, I heard from someone in Glasgow who is a lot more intelligent than I am, is that the world central banks have spent $8 trillion in the last 18 months printing new money to fight with COVID. And $100 billion a year has been going on forever and seems nowhere in sight. Even in Glasgow, the announcement was really that let's all get together to increase financing. So, and the other thing is, speaking as an Indian, poisonous air in North India is not going to come in 2070 or 2060. It is there today. So I think, even if we forget developed world financing, and apologies for those who represent developed world interests on this panel, I think it's crucial for us to do it for our own sake. We need to assume nothing else will come and find a solution and focus in the near term, 2025, 2030, and hopefully things will change. A couple of other quick points. Sticking to 5 minutes for an Indian is always a challenge, and I see I have got 23 seconds left, is that businesses have to lead, not follow governments. If we do not do that, and I particularly feel that about transportation, electric transportation is already, if you look at the life cycle cost, break even. And I think we quickly need to move. There is deep linkage between pollution and climate action. And if we do not move, as we see, if we continue to run diesel cars and vehicles, we will lose, at least in this country, the support of the society, the so-called social license to operate. And finally, in order to make this transition, I heard someone very eminent who mentioned that we need to invest in people in places. What happens in Bihar, Orissa, and Madhya Pradesh if all the coal mines close down? We need to find them other livelihoods. And I'll just stop there, Manish, and then perhaps take the specific questions a little bit later on financing and coal and so on. And apologies for overshooting by about half a minute.
Well, thanks, Rajiv. And I think you made a very, very important point. So I'm not going to just have those points put in just to ensure that we get a maximum out of this panel. Let me come back to Mansi, you. I mean, your opening sort of comments, the perspectives as you see this entire sort of a subject and the debate going around.
Sure, Manish, and a very good morning to all of you. And Manish, before I just begin, I just want to thank you all. Thank you for giving us this opportunity to be here and discuss about this topic. And just speaking from the question that you asked in your opening statement, Manish, which is, do we still need to discuss and debate about the terminologies of net carbon, sustainability, decarbonization, etc. And to then touching on Rajiv's point that these terminologies need no introduction. Absolutely. I think that is the most important talk of the town right now. I don't think that, we need to define those. We need to explain those either from a personal perspective or from a corporate perspective. I feel that these are lifestyle changes that each one of us, the employees in our organizations, you and me, our families, our children, corporates, investors, everyone. This is a lifestyle change that has been adopted by everyone in how we want to live our lives, in a sustainable manner. We want to breathe cleaner air, absolutely. We want to drink clean water. We want to, have a healthy future for our future generations as well. So no introduction needed to these terminologies, and it's a conscious call taken by each one of us. It is not. We can't put a cost of capital on these terminologies. We can't put an IRR on these. It is a binary switch. Yes, we want to have a sustainable living. Yes, we want to move towards decarbonization. So I think that is a clear point. I think that we need to make we need to make sure that we are here. In fact, at Vedanta here, Manish, and just to bring back a couple of analogies from the recent town hall that we had, we are celebrating the month of December as Decarbonization Month. And we have our strong vision of achieving net zero, as Dr. Jennifer also said in the initial ones. A lot of corporates, including us, we have this ambitious vision of net zero by 2050. But at the same time, we have broken that into sub-parts and sub-aims of 2025 and 2030. And we want to reduce our emissions by 25% by 2030. And we're working towards on how do we achieve that in the near term, on having those frameworks, on partnering with reputed firms like yours in that arena. And also to have an in-house management in place, which is not a separate vertical that works on ESG and carbon emissions, but that is actually a part of our business, a day-to-day operations, who run the operations and who have these KPIs linked to ESG. And just going back to the town hall that we were discussing at the start of this month, that we had, it was such a surprise that instead of explaining our ESG commitments and our vision to our employees, it was such a great and a refreshing feeling to get some inputs from them to us, to the entire management, that were an eye-opener, which basically shows us that it is not something that we need to drive. It is something that we need to live up to as an expectation. From simple suggestions such as turning our motor vehicles to electric motor vehicles gradually, to high-tech suggestions in terms of having more efficient boilers and furnaces in our smelters, etc. So I think these suggestions were well taken, and the most important part was, we felt it very refreshing and very confident in terms of driving our message to our employees. So that was something that we really enjoyed. And the last bit, Manish, that I'd just like to cover as an opening statement in terms of the investment and the financing landscape that the entire discussion is about. I feel that, again, I think both the equity markets and the debt markets are opening up to discussions on decarbonization. The investors, be it the private equity funds or even, in the debt markets, if we see the bondholders, they actually are looking for sustainability linked funds. They're looking towards decarbonization funds, and it's a lifestyle decision for them. They want to invest in businesses. They want to invest in corporations who are aware on these, who are taking good efforts in terms of moving towards net zero emissions, and are working towards them in a systematic manner and not just having visions out there. So I think that gap is reducing gradually. It's absolutely difficult and hard to abate sectors like ours, no doubt about that. And it's not going to happen in a flip of switch. It will take time. It will go gradually. But I think that appreciation of the efforts that some of these corporates are doing in terms of having that vision, one, and second, putting in those efforts. And these efforts are not qualitative. These can be quantified in different frameworks. And that is one gap I feel that we need to work a little more on, both as corporates as well as, engaging more partners in terms of defining what those steps and measures are that can be put into those frameworks in terms of achieving the targets that we have set for ourselves. So I think I'll leave it to that, Manish, but really look forward to this discussion and listening from all of you here on the panel.
Thanks, Mansi. Dr. Wang, good morning to you as well. And welcome on the panel. Just quick, I think you are on a mute right now. Your opening comments in the statement, Dr. Wang, on the entire subject before I go. And as I said, at the start, I'm just taking opening comments for 5 minutes, and then I have a specific questions for each of the co-panelists. Over to you, Dr. Wang.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, very much. Please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Manish. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm Sheldon Wang from the World Bank. I now lead the bank Indian Energy Program. Very happy to be here. Sorry, I get a bit late. I couldn't. So from our World Bank point of view, even though I'm a banker, I have to say that I echo the sentiment about the financing spoken by the previous speaker, because I also believe that the policy is a prerequisite that drives market demand and drives financing. So let me talk a little bit in the opening about the energy transition decarbonization study we just recently done for India, since this whole the whole conference and the whole seminar is really about decarbonization. So we basically, before the COP26, explored two decarbonization pathways for India. One is really the government policy. The other is look at accelerated decarbonization, where the emission could peak in the 2030s and then come down, and that by the end of the day actually very much aligned with the carbon net zero by 2070 that announced by Prime Minister Modi at COP26. I won't go to the details of the study, but I just want to highlight kind of three, I think, key findings I think were useful to share it here. It's a brand new study. We haven't formally kind of published it, but I'll be happy to share some of the key findings I think be useful to the audience here. 3 points. The first is that what we found is that it is the industry and transport sector that will drive the future energy demand and the emissions. The industry, particularly, both the sectors will count about 2/3 of the emissions by 2050. So this will be the new, I think, engagement also from the bank side to help India decarbonize these two sectors, which are much harder to decarbonize in the power sector. Even IEA said, half the technology are not really quite commercially viable yet. The second finding is that the reason that in the industry transport are the most difficult is largely thanks to the renewable energy revolution in India, right? India already announced a more ambitious solar target. At least in the power sector, we know there's a solar and wind. We know there are some solutions. But there, I think the key issue is that renewable need to scale up a lot more, almost 90% of the power capacity by 2050. And that brings two issues. One is that right now, the government renewable energy resource is quite limited. So will not be enough actually to support even the government-owned target. So either the resource need to be recessed, or India have to import hydro from the neighboring countries. And of course, the second issue is really the renewable grid integration will be really, really key, particularly battery storage. The third is, of course, we are a financing institution. It's about the need for financing and the huge financing requirement. Even to achieve government policy, our results suggest a need about $4 trillion for the next 30 years just to achieve government policy. And that's not business usual. That's already quite ambitious. And to achieve this accelerated decarbonization, need another, additional 2.5 trillion for the next 30 years, about 1% GDP per year. So again, the financing, it is important, but I also believe that if you get the pricing right, if you get the financial viability right, the financing will follow. So I'll stop here and talk more about our support in India in the Q&A section. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Wang. Very, very relevant points, very sharp, very focused. I will come back to some of the specifics around what you can do for India in the Q&A sort of a session. Girish, coming to you, your opening comments and a perspective as how you see this entire subject.
Okay, thank you, Manish, and for Anish for inviting me. My comments are broader beyond India, and I'm going to focus on this whole issue of net energy transitions. And when we say net energy transitions, we're essentially saying we want to get to a net zero, which is to get our emissions down to zero while also using offsets. And there needs to be a very significant focus on energy. And my kind of the key takeaway, and based on the research I've done and what I've written about, is that getting to net zero energy is not only technically feasible, but also economically viable. And that's the kind of the key takeaway I want to impart here. Now, that comes with caveats and details. Obviously, we have to look at, as some of my fellow panelists have already mentioned, it will depend on commercial viability, right? Some sectors are going to be easier to abate. We already talked about power being easier because wind and solar are already commercially viable. But even light-duty transportation or buildings, they're going to be easier to abate. Whereas some industries or some sectors are going to be harder to abate, like heavy-duty transportation. And it's already been mentioned, and as well as industry. But the good thing is that these sectors share many technologies that are common to these sectors, and some of these technologies are commercially viable now. For example, renewable energy and battery storage, and some of them will become commercially viable in the next 10 years. For example, green hydrogen, carbon capture and sequestration, and bioenergy. So I think as long as we are able to deploy the commercially available technologies at scale now and keep on developing these other technologies and then start scaling them in about 5 to 10 years, we are in good shape. But it does mean that we have to scale up the capacity of all these technologies by at least 10 times. And that's a significant undertaking. Now, the question is, and again, you see many different numbers around how much money do we need to get to net zero, how much money do we need to get these technologies to scale. And again, connecting to what my fellow panelists have already kind of mentioned, the numbers change, the absolute numbers change, but it looks like we need about 1 to 2% of the global GDP, right? Which global GDP just stands at around $100 trillion. So it should not be hard to do, especially given what kind of measures and what kind of money has been printed recently. So it's definitely viable. And so that's the kind of the point I want to make, that it's technically feasible and it's commercially viable. And so what remains to be done? And again, it connects back to the main driver, and I'm going to make 2 points here. The main driver is definitely going to be policy. And we need policy at all levels. At a very high level, I think we should still talk about pricing carbon, because that's still the least cost policy. But we have to keep on supporting key technology developments. We have to drive energy efficiency, and we have to ensure, as it was just discussed, we have to make that the key infrastructure is available as the technologies scale. Okay. The second point that I want to make, and I'm echoing what you had said initially, Manish, is that a lot of these deployment at scale is going to come in developing countries. And that does require some kind of global capital flows. And then we can talk about what could be potential barriers to these global capital flows. But in absence of these global capital flows to these developing countries, it's going to be hard to do. So we need to ensure that these global capital flows do happen. So I'll stop here and let's connect back in the Q&A.
Thanks, Girish. I mean, all very well made points and very focused as well. And I will come back to some of the specifics ones, especially on this transition and capital a little later. LB, coming to you, I mean, your opening comments and perspective as you see, and especially on some of the policy side stuff, which Girish also alluded to.
Thank you, Manish, and thank you for inviting me here. Great to hear perspectives from all my co-panelists. I will pick up 2 points for, propounding something here, given that we have, a lot of people who are very important stakeholders. One, I want to talk about transition capital. I think that's a very important part of the whole discussion. For us to achieve our objectives, we need to deal with the transition. And I think some of the points which were touched earlier, including by Rajiv, is how are we going to deal with the impact of, shutting down some of our, businesses and enterprises. Unless we create an asset class which is able to capture the benefits of transition, and, like the way we had CERs earlier, and that was linked to, generation. And I think now we need to think of creation of an asset class which represents the benefits of transition, which, talks about, which sort of, gives the value, creates value for what is the transition. And then, probably think of that as a security or a, tradable asset class, which then allows capital to come and, support that. We're not going to, find it easy to, deal with transition. Otherwise, a lot of discussion is about, there is talk about availability of capital. We all know what is required to fund the transition, but how are you going to actually implement it? And, as a sort of a practitioner, I'm thinking that, we all need to put our minds together and propound an asset class which will then represent the, cost of transition, which will represent what does it take to fund it and allow people to come and participate. So that's one thought I want to leave on the table, for everyone to sort of, debate and consider. So create a new asset class which will then help finance the transition, which will allow various stakeholders to come and participate in creation of this asset class, and make sure this asset class can then fund all the economic cost of the transition, capital which is already at play, lives and livelihood, and a lot of things which can come within that. Second, 100 gigawatt to 700 or 500, whatever we spoke about, that's not going to happen in the present policy framework. We need the policy framework to be disrupted completely. It's not about bandage. It's not about fixing, something here and there. It's a complete overhaul. How are we going to fund this unless we disrupt the regulatory framework? The present, stakeholders, be it SECI, NTPC, Hydro, NHP, whatever you call that, that's not enough. That's not enough. They're not able to support the present, bankable creation of infrastructure for this. We're talking about 5 times and 7 times. So it's a complete disruption of the ecosystem, the industry, which is sort of required for us to get to that. Rajiv was more honest when he said that he doesn't see it happening. But if I were to wear a more positive and optimistic sort of hat to this, I would like all of us to think and debate, what does it take for us to get there? It's present, it's not possible. It's maybe 10 of these institutions. We need 10 SECIs, and we can't have the discoms come and disrupt all of this. So what does it take? So the complete overhaul of the distribution system, disbanding all of them, and maybe go closer to the market, grow closer to the market in terms of how do you get to a sustainable way of building this. It's not possible in the present framework. So starting with a clean slate and saying that what does it take for us to develop this, disbanding the present architecture and look at it saying, this is what it takes for us to go there, and do a gap analysis. And if this is not possible, then again talk about what is the asset class we need to finance for us to get to this. So I'll stop here and hand it back to Manish. Thank you.
Very important 2 points that you make, and the distribution has been, you and I know very well that we have been talking for decades now, not even for years. And therefore, the entire ambition that is being talked about on the renewables actually hinges on that one disruption in distribution that can take it away. Okay, Sato-san, coming to you. Your opening comments, please, as you see the entire perspective, and then given the fact that you are also getting impacted as to how do we see a natural gas increasing the entire penetration. And then also the upstream investments, which is on oil and gas. Getting a sort of a challenge given the transition that one is talking about. So your opening comments and the perspective, please, Sato-san. You are on a mute, Sato-san.
Hello.
Yes, now we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Okay. So you are not using my PowerPoint?
We can, Ruchika, can we just have a quick this thing, please? Yeah, we have.
Okay. Sorry. Hi, Manish. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. And since I'm only Japanese and I'm quite new to India, so let me briefly introduce myself and my company and some Japanese government financial activities for the decarbonization. So next slide, please. So I joined Osagas 30 years ago. And the reason why I joined Osagas is I believe natural gas is a clean energy, and enhancing the natural gas is good for the environment. And I'm quite keen for the environment. So I studied in the US 20 years ago about environment pollution control. And the theme of my master paper is the impact of global warming policy on natural gas consumption. So I believe I'm the right person for this panel. And in recent 10 years, I'm working on the business development in Asia. And also this is again, enhancing the natural gas usage in Asia is good for the global warming. So next, please. So Osagas is quite old gas company. We started the gas supply from 1905. So we supply gas almost 115 years. And now we sell gas and electricity to about 9.4 million customers. And next, please. So in compliance with the Japanese government announcement for the carbon neutral in 2050, we also established a carbon neutral vision for 2050 carbon neutral. But again, I do agree that we have to do something before 2050. So we are concentrated on low carbonization before the decarbonization. So we target for 2030 to decrease the CO2 emission about 10 million tons per year. So we think natural gas plays a quite important role for the transition to the decarbonization. So next, please. So we are creating a business in Singapore, Thailand, Indonesia, and Vietnam. And next, please. The reason why we concentrate on the Asia is Asia is still heavily dependent on the coal. India is also same, I believe. So I think the natural gas demand is still increasing until 2050, even though people say natural gas is a fossil fuel, but actually we do need the natural gas. So next, please. introduced natural gas is, I believe, quite contribute to the reduction of the CO2, and the Japanese government financially support our activity. That is, I would like to share about the idea of the joint crediting mechanism, so-called the JCM mechanism. That is a subsidy from the Japanese government. And the country which has a bilateral agreement with the Japanese government, in that country, we can get a subsidy for the capex to the fuel conversion from coal to natural gas. So this is one example in Vietnam. We supported our customer to change the fuel from coal to natural gas. And we can achieve the CO2 reduction about 7,600 tons per year, only for the one factory. So that is a financial support from the Japanese government. And the next, please. And the next one is same the support for also the PV project. So we introduced the PPA type of rooftop solar business in the factory, and we can reduce the 4,200 tons of CO2 per year, thanks to the Japanese government subsidy. Lastly, I would like to talk about a little bit about India activity. With our partner company, AGNP, which does the CGD business in India, which will supply the gas by 2035, about 3.8 billion cubic meter. And the total investment is 3.3 billion USD for the infrastructure enhancement. So we believe that this project can contribute to reduce the CO2 in India, about 29 million tons of CO2. So that's a huge project, and we are quite happy to support this project. But unfortunately, the JCM mechanism is not established yet between Japan and India. So I hope if that once they establish this mechanism, I think we can accelerate natural gas enhancement in India. Thank you.
Thanks, Sato-san, and that was very sharp and very focused. Thank you very much. I mean, Rajiv, let me come to two specific sort of questions and a quick sort of a view. I don't think I would have a time probably to a third one, though I was very keen to pick your brains on that. I think one, I think you talked about the entire renewable capacity, 500 gigs, and I think LV spoke about as well. But the policy disruption, distribution, we know. What is that, I mean, that you believe, if we have to really talk of that kind of a scale? I think, I mean, and you will agree that we have really changed the scale and the size in the last 3-4 years. But from here onwards, if you are looking at the new ambition, what is that one sort of a change that you would like to see? I mean, LV talked about distribution, maybe 10 SECIs. What is that you would like to see? That's the first question. Second, on the fossil fuel side, and you yourself has some capacity as well. I mean, do you think it is I think, I mean, a signal-wise, probably we are already signaling the retirement of that capacity, but what will it make the transition less painful? I mean, because as you know, I mean, there's a lot of investment, not just in terms of equity and the debt of a banking system or the developers, but also, I mean, how does it impact the grid and the supply? I mean, what we saw a few weeks back when we were talking of a shortage of a coal stock and the blackouts being happening. So 2 questions to you, Rajiv.
Yes, thanks very much, Manish. I'll try and be short. You know, LV was bang on, but LV is also younger than me, so he's more idealistic. You know, if you ask what is the one change, well, I would just say a complete withdrawal of the state from the sector, a total privatization. But I recognize that, you know, like net zero, we will have to wait decades on that. And I started my initial thoughts by saying I'm more interested in 2025 and 2030. So what can we do? A few small practical steps will go a long way. You know, payment of all subsidies by direct benefit transfer will go a long way. What is envisaged in the electricity bill about limiting the amount of cross subsidy, 20% or whatever it may be, will go a significant way. And I have certainly, well, I'm personalizing it. Many of us have been telling the government that the days of plain vanilla solar and wind bids should be behind us. I think, you know, if SECI or the state of Gujarat, for that matter, is conducting is asking bids for 250 megawatt solar, it should tag along a 25 megawatt battery with it. I think we need to start it now. So you know, in the short term, simple practical steps, perhaps youngsters like LV would call it Band-Aid, but I'm old and I want something to be done before I retire. But in a more fundamental sense, really there is no way out but the withdrawal of the state from the sector. So complete privatization. That's your question number one. Talking about question number two, very important point. Last month I was shocked to know in the month of November the actual contribution of coal-fired power plant, just coal. I'm not talking I'm not talking gas. In the monthly demand was 79%, 79%.
Wow.
So we talk about 2/3 coming from coal on a yearly basis. Last month was 39%. So it's humbling to see how much dependent we still are. And as I mentioned before, we have never accepted, for various reasons, the concept of a transition fuel. So that's on the one side. On the other side, and I'm fond of making this comment, and this does come from me. We mistakenly think that building more solar farms and wind farms actually reduces emission. It does not. They actually made from cement and steel, which are heavily carbon dioxide intensive. So that saves carbon only in a theoretical sense of if you had not done and had built instead a coal-fired power plant. There is no net reduction. What reduces carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, talk about the power sector, is closing down coal-fired power plants. Now, how do you go on do that? I have seen very initial, and here is what my parent group has done one of that in Australia, and we have Madam Wong from the World Bank as well. One of the unsexy but important developments in COP26 was finalization of the Article 6 rules of the Paris Agreement as well. I think the development of a global carbon market, and perhaps, so let's say I have a coal, and we do have a coal-fired power plant in Haryana, which comes to the end of its PPA in 2037. Now, with the help of World Bank, ADB, what have you, can someone come to the market and pay, just as an example, I don't mean necessarily pay us, but pay some of these power plants and not be too aggressive. Instead of 2037, can we close it in 2030? And we shut it down in 2030, and then, through the global carbon market or carbon price or some sort of a market-based mechanism, pay the debt holders and the equity holders so we do not have a raft of stranded assets all over the country. So those are some of the ideas, and we have seen that. As I said, CLP had a plant in the Latrobe Valley in Victoria, in Australia, which was meant to close in 2032. The government there, the state of Victoria, has given a certain amount of money, so it is now closing in 2028, and that is together with investment in 100 megawatt hour battery and retraining of the staff so no one loses a job. So some such mechanism, looking power plant by power plant, and putting that in place, which is dependent on market. If we get good financing, or then, as you know, I'm a little bit cynical about any concessional financing. But if we can get that, so much the better. But I think there are market-based mechanisms which can make that transition happen. So those would be my
very good thoughts. Very good thoughts, and I think some of the thoughts have come out so far, and I will sort of work with Anish and the team to really see that can we put in a very sharp paper and get to the right stakeholders. I think jumping to Girish. Girish, I know, we have exchanged some thoughts which is linked to what Rajiv said. So two questions to you. First is the same one on the coal retiral one and the retirement one. What are the mechanics and the structures that you can think of? Rajiv made a very, very important point. What other things from your perspective as you see global markets? And in the Indian context, he talked about 79% of a monthly demand coming from this. You just can't suddenly stop that capacity. And also there's a lot of investments running around that. What that you think as a different structures which is possible? That's the first question. And the second is, specific to power sector. And I think we have been talking about distribution has been the biggest pain point for us for decades, including the currency hedging, which is also very relevant when the capital flows to India, and the payment security mechanics. Are there any sort of a structures, thought process you would have? That's the second question to you, Girish.
Okay, thank you. And it's good that, I'm kind of adding on to what's been said already. But just to a little bit of more of context setting before I talk about this whole coal retirement, and I'm going to be brief. And it's becoming very clear that, we don't just need to do more renewable energy or more renewable power. We have to do less coal. And there's been work done by many institutions, and there are numbers on this. Like, this is how much coal capacity needs to be retired, and not just in India but worldwide. And the numbers are staggering. And these coal plants need to be retired between 2030 and 2050 to get to net zero. We're talking about 850 gigawatts of coal capacity in China itself. We haven't talked about China, and China is the biggest kind of gorilla in town. And that dwarfs completely what needs to be done in OECD, which is around 200 gigawatts of coal capacity, and the rest of the world is another 200 gigawatts of coal capacity that needs to be retired. Now, it is, again, the good news there is that the coal power in many cases is no longer cost competitive, right? I mean, I have myself done some analysis where if you look at a solar tariff of around 2 rupees per kilowatt hour, about 100 gigawatt of the coal power capacity in India is not economically viable. So economically, it's possible to do. How do you do it given the institutional structure, given the current structures that we have? And that's where this whole issue of just transition is going to come in, and just come again, adding back to what has been said already. The whole idea of, not only will you take care of jobs and local taxes, etc., but in some ways we have to compensate and make sure that it's an economically viable or an economic better option. And one way to do that is, and again, some work that I have done, is through repurposing of coal plants. And you can repurpose coal plants into solar, batteries, and even something called a synchronous condenser. This is the work I did with World Bank. You can actually, recoup about 30% of the capital expenditure of these repurposing options. So that's the context. It's all possible. Now, coming to your specific question on financing and financing mechanisms, right? And just to kind of add on to what has been said, I mean, there are options and there are financing mechanisms that exist today that are in play and that have proven very effective. And I'll give one example and kind of slightly more detail on this example, and then mention another one. So the first example that I want to go a little bit of detail in is called securitization, where especially for contracted assets, and a lot of the assets, coal assets in developing world are contracted. For a lot of the contracted assets, the ratepayer is already on the hook for paying because these are contracted for 30 years, right? So you can actually refinance these coal plants using a special purpose vehicle, using ratepayer surcharge, which is lower than what the ratepayer was already paying, and through the refinancing, bring the cost down and retire the plant immediately in some sense. And this whole process is called securitization. It's been used in the US quite a bit, right? So definitely that's possible. The second mechanism that I want to talk about is this whole idea of a carbon reduction fund or carbon retirement mechanism that was brought up at the World Economic Forum. And it has been also in active discussion with the Asian Development Bank when they're talking about the energy transition mechanism for many of the developing countries, including Indonesia and Philippines, where the idea is that you create a blended finance facility where you bring in the private investors and you also bring in concessional capital. I'm bringing in concessional capital, but it may be required. And you buy out those assets. And you buy out those assets, and that gives you a way, as you just said, to now it's owned by people who want to retire it. So the incentives are aligned, and you can use this fund to retire these assets early. And that fund also allows, and there's been discussions around how to use carbon pricing, etc. But I think these two mechanisms, securitization and the carbon reduction mechanism, hold a lot of promise. And I think, Dr. Wong may know more about this, but a lot of these multilaterals are behind this. So I'll stop here on the coal retirement options and the mechanisms that have been used on this. Coming quickly to the renewable energy question that you asked, right? And I don't want to take too much time. Renewable energy has been discussed a lot. But again, obviously we have to do less coal, but we have to do more renewable energy, and we have to do more renewable energy in developing countries. That's going to be the driving force going forward. And we have to ask ourselves, what's going to be in the way? How are we going to get capital to flow towards projects in renewable energy in developing countries? And the risks are common. Risks are political risk are currency risk are counterparty risk or the off-taker risk. And all these require some kind of a risk reduction mechanism so that then the money can flow at not only the availability of capital is there, which is the binary switch, but also the cost of capital goes down. And the solutions do exist. I have done a lot of work on this in India specifically. We have designed currency hedging facilities using public money. We have designed payment security mechanisms. And they all give pretty good leverages of up to 10. And by leverage, I mean every dollar of public money brings in like $10 of private money, right? But these mechanisms need to be scaled at a global level. And at some level, I would like to bring up this whole idea of the common risk mitigation mechanism that ISA had proposed. And I had worked on some part of that. It needs to be brought back in and scaled. So I'll stop here. These are some of the solutions that I can think of, but happy to discuss them more.
Sure, Girish. I mean, I have a few follow-on, but I will let me first go to the panelists for each of the specific ones, and if time permits, I will come back to you. Mansi, coming to you, I mean, I know this point that I made earlier as well. I mean, the group operates in something which is hard to abate sector. And at the same time, I mean, very, very important for a growth of economy as well, right? I mean, they're very integral to the growth of industry. And some panelists also talked about that how, I mean, the study of a World Bank, and Dr. Wong mentioned that, I mean, on the industry and the transport to be focused on, how the group sees some of these sort of conversations going around in these sectors. And is there any thought process, what you feel about that? That's one. Second part is that from an entire ESG framework, I mean, do you feel that it can be a little more sort of an inclusive rather than just talking of a green, and a little more of what is happening and practically what is possible to achieve as well? So two questions quickly, Mansi, to you.
No, absolutely, Manish. I think well-framed questions out there in terms of the industry perspective. And I think this recently we have learned it through a little harder way when our coal thermal power plants were actually struggling to find coal, and we all were kind of in that scarce of whether we're going to have electricity at our homes and offices, etc. So I think that way we realized at least that some of these sectors are, though we keep putting them in the dark, but these are still the backbone of the economy. And the switch to greener alternatives is not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen with a flip of a switch. It's going to take some time. I completely understand Rajiv's impatience to, turn this switch to in a flip of a switch, but unfortunately, it will take some time. And how do we do that? But I absolutely agree with them in terms of, that the private sector will need to take that lead. Businesses like ours will need to take that lead in terms of not just commitment to it, but also to, devise a framework of how we do that. I think that is the most important piece of turning over a period of time, reducing our emissions over a period of time, at the same time ensuring that the backbone of the economy is not getting any weaker over a period of time. So I think that'll be important. And I will appreciate, LV's comment on that, on transition capital also. I think that is something like those is also need of the hour. We definitely need. We just can't, dispose of assets worth thousands of crores for nothing. We need to figure out what do we need to do with those, whether to figure out ways, technologically advanced ways or efficient ways in turning them to solar power plants, as Girish mentioned, or to, have specific funds or specific capital raising that can allocate to these industries in terms of going in a more efficient manner. So I think these structures will need to be devised over a period of time. That responsibility and that ownership needs to be definitely taken by the private sector and take that lead. And I think Vedanta is doing that in a very responsible way and has been doing that for a very long time now. It is just that it is coming out in discussions now because it's becoming top of the hour, but it's been there in our philosophy and our vision much earlier as well. Talking about a second point on ESG, I think from an overall perspective, I think I would even go beyond ESG and talk about the sustainability bucket that we kind of work under. I think it's not just environment, safety, governance, but it's also sustainable development, sustainable growth. We talk about transformation for good at Vedanta in three important aspects. One is transformation of communities, transformation of people, and transformation of our economy. So I think economy and environment. So I think those three buckets largely inculcates all the ESG aspects as well that we look at it. But on a particular ESG standpoint, I think we are very clear on not just reducing emissions in the next 9 years from baseline 21 to 2030, that the targets we have, but also focusing on each of these aspects in terms of a more sustainable development and a more sustainable living going forward. But I think it is not something that a corporate can do on its own. Policy framework needs to be supplementing to it. A lot of support from the funding and the capital market side needs also to support that in terms of providing those opportunities and turning them gradually and sooner than later, actually. So I think those support is required both from a government side, both from a capital market side, both equity and debt. And that gap has been reducing over time, Manish. I think that one thing that we need to definitely appreciate is that gap has been reducing both in equity markets and debt markets. I think it has been reducing. We are still not there where we want to be. We're still talking about it more than we're actually taking actions in it. So I think, but it is getting closer, and I hope in the near future it gets even much more closer. I think in the interest of time, I'll just hand it back over to you, Manish.
Thanks, Mansi. Dr. Wong, coming to you, you mentioned a very important key takeaways of the study that you've done, and I hope, that study comes out in the market and we can have a detailed sort of a look at it. But two specific questions, which flows from some of the outcome of the study. You talk of I think the larger point you made is that even if we try, India doesn't have enough resources to really achieve what we are trying to target to. And you talked about some import, etc. for hydro. I feel that we have enough hydro resources. We have just not done anything about the hydro at all, actually, from the resources that we have. But my question is twofold. One, I think the demand that India made during COP26, which is more about a direct transfer from a developed world to a developing nations like us, whether in terms of a technology or the capital or the financing, do you think actually this is going to pan out? That's one. Second, I think specific to World Bank, how is World Bank actually going to contribute to the India's decarbonization sort of a play? And my question is a little more drilled down, if I can take a liberty, is that, the kind of structures or the kind of funding mechanics that the multilaterals have looked at, which is through India, looking at some of the programs very specifically designed. I think given the kind of a capital needs and the issues that we are grappling with, do you see some change in that metric is going to happen, which can make this capital more easily accessible by many more than today it is currently being given to? So over to you, Dr. Wan.
Thank you, Manish. First let me talking about mostly the financing issue you address. I think for the developed country to developing country transfer, I kind of echo what the Raji said, that on the one hand, of course, this is really important, which I will talk a little bit more in a minute. But I think that many developing countries are also just sitting there waiting for this concessional financing, this technology transfer to come, which, for the past few decades, to be honest, I think this kind of assistance from the developed countries is unlikely, put this way, is unlikely to come as the scale and the speed enough to actually get us to the 1.5 degree world, that target. So I think that's unfortunately is the reality. I think I do believe that country needs to take action now rather than waiting, for this money to come. Now, there are some progress, of course, on the financing side, and I do think that in some areas are important. So for the financing, particularly concessional financing, I think the area that's important, kind of three areas in my mind. One is really about new technologies, battery storage and green hydrogen and electric vehicle need this concessional financing from the government, from the MDBs, the development banks like us to help. And the second is really about the just transition. We talk a lot about the coal. I have worked in almost all the major coal countries, China, South Africa, Indonesia, Vietnam, Poland, Turkey. And I think they all share a similar thing with India. That is, they do really well on the clean side, but then there's really struggling on this coal transition side, which is really, I think, the new focus for the COP26. So this just transition need lots of money, to compensate the workers, the environment reclamation. We just look at the Germany, 40 billion euro, right, just to close down their coal power plants. India had many times more. So the just transition definitely need concessional financing. And third is really the infrastructure, the charge infrastructure, the transmission lines, and even the US, the infrastructure bill have the charging infrastructure. So those I think need concessional financing. So good news is that we at the World Bank, we are the largest climate financier in climate action in developing world today. We finance about $21 billion a year climate finance, about 32% our portfolio, and our target is reaching 35% portfolio by 2025. And in India, particularly for the energy sector, we have about $3 billion portfolio, another $3 billion in the pipeline in the making, and mostly energy transition. So our support in India energy transition is really along the 5-pillar approach. And the first is really about the renewable energy, right? We finance the rooftop solar, the solar parks, the hydro. We're planning to finance a big, $1 billion program on the battery storage and those areas. And the second is really on the supply energy efficiency side, particularly the distribution reform. We piloted in Rajasthan, West Bengal, in a few state level, and now we're supporting the whole national government. This, I think it's a $40 billion distribution program, reform program. We finance a slice of, we plan to finance a slice of that. And the third is really demand energy efficiency. Particularly partner with EESL, we finance the demand side efficiency in the building in the industry sector, and the last two pillars are the ones that we want to do more in the future, which is really critical. I think flowing out of the study I just talking about. One is the industry transport decarbonization. As I mentioned, this is really important, and so we want to do more of those. We plan to finance the charging infrastructure, the EVs, and also want to go into the industry decarbonization space. And the last one is we just talking about is the just transition, including the coal mine closure and the coal power plant repurposing. I think the previous speaker said very, very nicely about this repurposing the coal power plants. We're trying to do that now in India, China, South Africa, Morocco, for try this repurposing thing. And also the Indian government requested a large program for us to help on the coal mine closure. We have done this in East Europe, in China, in other places, how to do the just transition for people, for the environment. So this is basically how we kind of a comprehensive program to support India's energy transition. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wang. A very important point, and gave us some good insight as to what this can look like as we go in the future. Sato-san, coming to you, I mean, and I alluded to that earlier. I mean, given what's happening in the upstream oil and gas sort of a space, right? I mean, where you're a little bit struggling, I mean, in terms of a capital that is flowing into that part of a business due to all sort of a debate around the emissions and the entire ESG framework. I mean, what impact will it have from a downstream business that you have on the natural gas side? I mean, also it has an impact on the pricing as well. If you can just quickly have how you're dealing with that, and then one quick sort of a comment around, given your emerging market sort of an investments, I mean, including the country like India. I mean, is there anything on the policy regulatory framework that you feel is going to act as a little more catalytic to make that investments actually translate into reality? Just quick comments, Sato-san, on that. We can't hear you, Sato-san.
Sorry, so I make it short because the time is running out. So about the lack of the supply of energy because of they are hesitating the finance on the upstream investment. That's really a problem. And one of the reasons is the natural gas is treated as same as the other fossil fuel, which is like natural gas is also enemy for the global warming. But I think that, as I mentioned, natural gas is quite important for the transitional energy for the decarbonization. This can contribute to the low carbonization. So if they don't recognize such as the importance of natural gas and they try to put the pressure on the investment of the upstream project in the natural gas, that will cause the lack of the supply. And that leads to the high price of the gas in the downstream market. And the final, so question is who is paying such cost for the high price? That is a final consumer, not us. It's a final consumer. So I think that's the problem. That the matter of the people's willing to pay how much cost for the decarbonization. So if they don't like such high cost of the energy, they should recognize that natural gas is important and there is still need for the transition, and they have to ease the pressure on the investment for the upstream. Then they can recover from the supply capacity. I mean, the new investment, the supply upstream is increased, then they can get more supply capacity. But I think it takes some time to start some new supply of the energy project. So in few years from now, I think we have to face the volatility of the price of the energy because of the unstable supply. So that's my point. The second point too is the investment in the emerging market. I think, as I mentioned, I think it's quite a good chance to contribute to reducing the CO2 because utilizing our technology to the high efficient energy usage of natural gas. So we want to accelerate the investment. But our concern is actually there's corruption. Corruption is, I think that our management also quite worried about the corruption risk in the emerging country. So if the compliance is getting better in the emerging country, it's going to be easy for us. And also we use governmental support for the financing, such as we jointly invested in JBIC, it's a Japanese governmental bank. So this support can also be good for the investment of the emerging country. That's my point too. Thank you.
Thanks, Sato-san. LB, coming to you, we are at the end of a session, but I think very important points. One macro question and one little bit more micro in the Indian context specifically. You know, we are talking of, I mean, all this sort of a capital flowing in through green finance, ESG, and obviously the speakers, both Rajiv and Dr. Wang said, maybe we will not get to the extent what we are looking at and the speed, but still we will definitely have a lot more capital flowing in. Now, how do you sort of play the policy framework that the developed nations are used to versus what they will actually get, let's say, if it comes to India? Is there a sort of a gap that you see there? Or I think we are okay to attract that sort of a capital? That's point number one. The second, which is very specific, you know, we all know what happened in AP and then recently what Punjab did. Right, or they're trying to do, for example. Now, on one hand, we are talking of a 500 gigs, 700 gigs. On the other hand, you have a states like this, which is coming out clearly with something which completely is so disruptive that as an investor, I will be so wary of both equity and the debt coming in. How do you actually, even if it happens, probably you may not be able to stop it, but let's say even it happens, what policy measures or what actions or interventions you can think of where we can actually act very quickly and very fast to stop, I mean, if some of the state are thinking or coming out like this, because that is going to give a comfort to the investors that, okay, I mean, this may happen, but there is also equally very strong reaction to ensure that it just gets stopped where it is originating. Just two questions to LV.
Thank you. I'll take the second one first, and then I'll come to the first one. I think on the second one, I think we need a market-based response to these initiatives. Expecting our entire legal system to sort of, change or gear up for a specific, solution to a particular state's, intervention to business or contracts, that is not going to happen. That's like reforming our legal system, which is, work in progress and will, go on, for a few years, Rajiv, beyond me as well. So I think the market and capital will have to respond to these interventions in a more serious way. If you have, states like Andhra Pradesh and, Punjab who intervene in, these kind of situations, I'd like to see, what will be the response to their projects, when there's a bid from the state next time. So is the capital demanding more accountability from states? I would put that as the question, and that may be a better, response, and that's entirely in our hands. And as the Indian infrastructure sort of is evolving, this conversation 10 years back, 15 years back would have had, very different people on the panel. I think today we have, I would call it the phase of change in the phase of Indian, infrastructure. You have, private equity, you have long-term sort of patient capital, people, Rajiv represents, we have, those players coming in and occupying center stage. So I would expect that they would demand better accountability, from the market, from the system, from the existing players. And that's going to drive how we're going to create, the next sort of phase of assets in the Indian infrastructure and energy market. I think that's the real key. Capital can demand better accountability, and the market will change if they do so. But if, we get into the same competitive game which we saw 10, 15 years back, Manish, and how all of these sort of, evolved when many coal plants were put on, bids and, the kind of tariffs which came, not sustainable. We have not learned from the lessons of Enron is what I would say. But huge opportunity here for us to learn from that. And ultimately, we have to build sustainable business. And that sustainable business is the only answer for situations like what we see in Punjab or Andhra. And I think we need to demand better accountability from all the stakeholders for us to avoid these problems going forward. Yes, the legal system will respond, but it takes a while to change the approach towards, contract enforceability in India. We have, administrative bodies, we have judiciary, we have quasi-judicial bodies, changing the composition of the regulatory system and, how we bring in judicial members. I think all of this is work in progress. I think the better answer or better response will be capital must demand better accountability from the market. That is the second that's the answer to your second question. Going to the first question, I think our policy framework has to change for us to, get to this. And I think we all have a role to play, Manish, and I think there's a lot more which we can do. And I think today is just the beginning. It's one of the many conversations we're going to have. I'd be very happy to work with, you and other stakeholders in this to come up with more specifics on what kind of policy changes we need to get to it. And I think I'd go back to the opening, comment I made. We have to think of creating an asset class which is, can be funded, can be traded. And that asset class, should either find a way to the P&L or balance sheet of people who are willing to participate in this program to finance transition. For some people, it could be P&L. For some people, it could be balance sheet. But unless we create a framework, which is financeable, we won't be able to, find a way for the capital to reach their respective destinations. I'll stop there and hand it back to you, Manish.
Well, thanks, LV. And I think we have, Anish, I have overshot the session a bit, but I think the co-panelists and in each one of them, the perspective they bring and so much to contribute. I thought, I mean, I can take a liberty of a few extra minutes, Anish, from you. I saw some questions on the Q&A, but I think I will probably offline respond to them rather than taking time from other sessions, Anish. One request, I think, before I end the session, Anish, it will be good that some of the very important points came through this conversation. I don't think in the past, while a lot of points have been made, but the points made here have a little different orientation and the character. I mean, this point about that it is not about more renewables is going to solve your problem. It is also to retire the coal. When you retire the coal, you look at the capital, you look at the jobs, you look at transition funds. I mean, you look at, I mean, how you transition, as Girish was saying, and then Dr. Wong also said that you create a funds and actually somebody comes in who has the incentives and the purpose aligned towards retirement. I think that's a more transition that we talked about. We also talked about some of the stuff on the measures that LV is talking about, an asset class which can be financed, funded as well. And the larger point from my perspective, as I see, is that it is not that the developed world is going to just get the capital, concessional finance, the speed, the ticket size, as Rajiv and Dr. Wang again said, is going to just come in so easily. So I think maybe, Anish, it will be good just to leave a thought with you is to capture some of the thoughts which came in and then work with some of the stakeholders on this panel and then really get to the stakeholders at the government and other levels as well to make these points. I'm not sure that they really understand the entire context of what we have to change with a more disruptive sort of a mode. So thanks again for each of the co-panelists. I think you made the session very, very interesting. I thought our audiences enjoyed, and I will probably come back on the online questions a little later. Over to you, Anish.
Thank you, Manish, and thank you so much to the whole panel. I think there's some very, very important points and some accent brought to some of those points. It's not that we don't know those points, but the specific focus on the high priority items, I think I made a note of it. And we'll review this whole conversation, which was fascinating, pick up and make them sharper. And given that, we talk about these things with the policymakers, I think there will be occasions to push that ahead. Also, just to make another point that we are setting up a decarbonization hub in KPMG.